Hello, history lovers! Today we're going to be talking about Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymore, continuing my series of the wives of Henry VIII. She's the third one in the rhyme divorced, beheaded, died. And that's pretty much all most people know about her, and to be honest, I've always found her Henry's most boring wife, and that's pretty much all there is to know about her.
Lovely Jane Seymore was three, the love of a lifetime for me. She gave me a son, little Prince Ed. Then poor old Jane went and dropped dead.
To be fair to Jane, there wasn't all that much time for there to be that much history about her. She didn't really do a lot with her life before marrying Henry, and she died very soon after being married to him. Had she lived, would there have been major events in her life? Well, maybe not, given her character. She wasn't someone who would ever take on leading an army the way Catherine of Aragon did. She would never have stood up to Henry on anything the way Anne Boleyn did. She was known as the pious, the submissive queen. She was basically the ideal of what a woman should be at the time. In other words, doormat. I'm sorry, but that's what Jane Seymore was. However, she might have been a little more interesting had she lived longer. Now, she's remembered as the queen that Henry loved most. Okay, yes, because she gave him a son and she didn't live long enough to get into any major confrontation with him. And I'm going to talk about one of the few confrontations they had later on. It was over quickly, let's just say that. I'll get more into that in a moment. But I'm amazed that Henry looked twice at her, because she was not, first of all, I'm not saying this is what an ideal woman should be. I'm saying this is what a king of England at the time would have looked at in an ideal wife. And Jane Seymore did not match that. To start off with, she wasn't all that high born. She wasn't a princess. She wasn't even technically nobility. She was just country gentry, basically.
Her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, and her father, Sir John Seymour, were not members of the nobility, but were still part of England's well-to-do gentry. And besides this, Jane was still a descendant of King Edward III through his son Lionel of Antwerp.
Now, I do not in any way hold this against Jane herself, and I would be disgusted to see a woman thought of in these terms today. I am disgusted at the fact that it still goes on in a lot of cases today. But I'm saying from a historical viewpoint, at these times especially, women were looked at as breeders, especially if you're in the monarchy and you want to provide an heir. Now, looking at it in those disgusting terms, Jane didn't have the best bloodlines. So again, I'm surprised that Henry looked twice at her. And I often wondered what the attraction was. She was considered okay looking for a time, but she wasn't considered a raving beauty. But again, I hate to think of women in those terms. I hate to think of anyone looked at in those terms, but I'm looking at history through the standards of the time here. And looking at that, I don't see why Henry was interested in her either. She also did not have the best of education.
Unlike Henry's first two wives, Jane was not highly educated. Her parents had given her a very traditional style of education for a young woman expected only to marry well and produce heirs while helping manage an estate. A priest was hired at Wolf Hall, most likely for her brothers, but it is possible it was partly for the daughters in a rudimentary way.
Okay, so let's continue with that line of wondering why Henry VIII was attracted to her. She wasn't all that high born. She wasn't well educated. She wasn't even considered all that good looking by the standards of the time. In fact, she was getting a little past childbearing years. So for Henry to, Henry wanted a male heir more than anything. Jane was 27 years old by the time he took notice of her. Past childbearing by, these days, not unheard of for a 27-year-old woman to have a child. Back then, that was seen as, okay, you're getting past this point in your life. So, what was the attraction? My theory is two different reasons. One, as I said before, she was a doormat, or at least could play the part of a doormat. Now, that was the complete opposite of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was fiery tempered, intelligent, independent. She had a brain of her own and she fully intended to use it. She was not the type to sit back and let Henry VIII do whatever he wanted. So I think that was part of the attraction, was she was the opposite of Anne Boleyn. And that relationship had soured big time, and they had actually argued fairly frequently in public by this point.
But it was in September 1535 that Henry began to really take notice of her. His relationship with Anne had been stormy for a long time after marrying her in January 1533, and he now regularly argued with the new queen.
So, yeah, Henry's idea of the perfect wife was a wife who wouldn't argue with him, who would never talk back. Basically, somebody who had no brain of her own. Jane Seymore really fit this role for him. Or, like I said, at least he was good at acting the part. Another reason Henry might have been attracted to her was because she came from a large family. People in her family had no problem having loads of kids, so he might have thought, okay, she should be easy to have a son with. Like I said, she was getting to be seen as past childbearing years by this point, but I think that was part of Henry's thinking that, okay, her family's known for having lots of kids. Now, how did Henry first meet Jane? Well, Jane had been lady in waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and to Anne Boleyn. She was much closer to Catherine of Aragon and actually was good friends with, well, yeah, I would say good friends is fair to say. She was on really good terms with Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary, the future Bloody Mary. So, she, again, had been not openly opposed to Anne because she was also one of Anne's ladies in waiting, but you can see where she was basically Anne's opposite, and that's part of what attracted Henry at this point. Now, Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymore did not get along while Jane was Anne's lady in waiting, for the obvious reason that Henry had his eyes on Jane, and Anne didn't like being cheated on. Now, I hear a lot in different historical pages of, oh yeah, Anne got what she gave. Henry cheated on Catherine with her, so now it was her turn to be the cheated on one. Not quite. Okay, Anne never openly paraded in front of Catherine saying, oh ha ha, I've got your husband. Jane basically did that.
Anne had noticed Jane idly messing about with a locket around her neck, opening and closing it while looking down like a lovesick puppy at the portrait inside. Anne was well aware of who Jane was probably looking at, and after confirming it was a miniature portrait of Henry, she snatched it off Jane's neck, supposedly so hard that her fingers bled. There was,
as I said in my talk about Anne Boleyn, I don't think Anne even wanted to get with Henry at first. Her family basically pushed her into that, And she honestly did try to avoid him. She even tried to go to her own home of Heber Castle, tried to keep her distance, but Henry basically didn't take no for an answer with her. I don't think it was a case of her wanting to seduce Henry away from Catherine. I think Anne just was a woman put in a position where she couldn't refuse him anymore. Jane, on the other hand, was playing the game to get Henry. Now, everybody knows that Anne Boleyn had her downfall and was sentenced to execution. On that day, Jane was actually debating what to wear for her wedding. I'm not making this up, and this is actually shown in the Private Life of Henry VIII, which is an older movie, not very historically accurate, but it is accurate on this.
Now the headdress, madam. Oh, yes. Now, which one shall I wear? The velvet coif or the pearl chaplet?
Yeah, now that is pretty dang cold. Now, you can't talk about Jane Seymore without talking about Anne Boleyn. And one thing I didn't add in my video about Anne Boleyn was just how rushed her funeral was. They didn't even have a coffin for her. Now, they'd known she was going to be executed, but nobody arranged to have a coffin. What they did for Anne was they emptied out an old arrow chest that was too short for her full length body. Well, her head's gone anyway, just tuck that under her arm. Good enough. Yeah. Now, Henry and Jane waited an entire day after this to get engaged, and an entire 10 more days to get married. Now, Jane was very good, like I said, at submitting to Henry, being the doormat. But there was one time, notably, when she did stand up to him, and that was when there was a bit of a Catholic uprising, and she asked for basically mercy for the uprisers and for some of the smaller monasteries to be restored to the Catholic Church.
This was not unheard of. Since Anglo-Saxon times, it had been the place of the Queen to beg for clemency for prisoners, often with a behind-the-scenes agreement already in place that the King agreed but didn't wish to appear weak. But in Jane's case, her proposition was thoroughly rejected with an explosive burst of Henry's foul temper, and Henry reminded her of the fate Anne had met with when she tried to meddle in his affairs.
Okay, I suppose I have been hard on Jane calling her a doormat because really she didn't have a lot of choice. But at the same time, I can't help admire those who actually did take a stand. I know she didn't really have a choice in it, but I still wish she would have done more. Not that I get it. I get the standards at the time, but it is hard to accept. Anyway, of course, Henry forgave her. She, quote unquote, learned her place. And she did eventually have a son. Now, there's debate over whether or not she had a miscarriage before this. The the sources that say she did aren't generally considered the most reliable, so it's unknown whether Edward was actually her first child or she had a stillborn baby before that. But in any case, she did successfully give Henry the son that he wanted. But she didn't live long after that. She lived 12 days after the birth, and ironically, I have not been able to find the same documentary since, but I love to watch documentaries, and one that I saw said that it was actually Henry's being very careful with Jane that might have ended her life. He had only men doctors attending her. They weren't that familiar with the process of giving birth. If a midwife had been there, they might have been able to help her. Now, that depends on what actually it was that caused her to die. It might have been an infection, in which case, without antibiotics, there wasn't much anybody was going to do. Or it could have been a retained placenta, in which case a midwife would have been able to help her. It can't have been an easy last 12 days for her. And it was said that she was actually delusional before she passed away. She was the only one of Henry's queens actually given an official royal funeral. And she's actually the only queen also that's buried with Henry. I've been to London, and it was kind of cool to see all the historical places, and I got to see where she and Henry VIII are buried. Oddly enough, it's a flat black stone that has their names on it. It's nothing like the grand monuments you see in Westminster Abbey or like that. They're actually buried in St. George's Chapel, which is part of Windsor Castle. Very interesting chapel, a lot of famous burials there. I gotta say that when I was in London, Westminster Abbey was probably my favorite place, but St. George's Chapel was very, very well worth the visit if you're interested in history. So that brings us to the end of talking about Jane Seymore. And next up, I'll be talking about Henry's fourth wife, Anna Cleves. I hope you'll join me for that video, and I gotta say, even though I thought this would be boring to start with, as I got talking about her, you do gotta feel sorry for all of Henry's wives. I mean, their lives sucked. So, Anna Cleves actually broke that pattern. That's why I find her more interesting than I do Jane, and I'm gonna talk about her next time.